Hello, night seekers, and welcome to Midnight Scary Storyteller, a place where forgotten tales and gentle voices guide you softly into sleep, wrapped in mystery and shadow. Before tonight's story begins, don't forget to subscribe and tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment below. I always love seeing where these midnight stories find their way. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's drift together into the unknown. A few years ago, I had someone on Facebook who I'd gotten to know over time. We weren't close friends in real life, but we interacted often enough that I genuinely thought he was a great guy. He had a good sense of humor, was easy to talk to, and always seemed to have something interesting to say. Then one morning, he made a Facebook post that, at the time, just seemed like another strange story about a bad dream. Looking back now, I can't read it the same way. He wrote about a nightmare that had woken him up during the night. In the dream, he was hanging out with a group of people. They were relaxing, having a few drinks and talking, when they suddenly felt the ground shake. A second later, the power went out. Everything went completely dark. The group wandered outside, expecting the electricity to come back on soon. The entire neighborhood was blacked out. At first, nobody seemed especially worried. They kept talking, had another drink, and waited for the lights to return. Then he noticed something strange. Far off on the horizon was a bright orange glow. It wasn't sunrise. It wasn't sunset. It was coming from completely the wrong direction. As he watched, the glow became brighter. The air started getting warmer. In the distance, sirens began echoing through the darkness. Cell phone service had stopped working. No one knew what was happening. The uneasy feeling kept growing. The orange glow continued spreading across the horizon, and the heat became stronger with every passing moment. Then people appeared. At first, only a few. They were running toward him. Their clothes were burned. Some were covered in blood. They weren't speaking. They were screaming. Pure panic. For a moment, everyone in his group simply stood there, frozen, trying to understand what they were seeing. Then they looked beyond the people running toward them. Behind them was a massive wall of fire. It rolled forward with terrifying speed, swallowing everything in its path. One by one, the people running toward safety disappeared into the flames. The screaming snapped everyone out of their shock. The people he'd been standing with suddenly scattered in every direction. He described it like watching a school of fish instantly change direction to escape a predator. 1 second they were together. The next, he was completely alone. He knew he wasn't going to make it. He tried to run. He searched desperately for somewhere to hide. But there was nowhere to go. The heat grew stronger and stronger. He compared it to standing in front of an enormous blowtorch. As the flames rushed toward him, one thought crossed his mind. He wondered how much dying would hurt. Then the fire reached him. He wrote that the pain was unbearable. He was on fire. Terrified, all he could think was that he hoped it would be over quickly. Then he woke up. At the end of the post, he tried to make light of it. He joked that recurring nightmares like that happened because chronic back pain worked its way into his sleep, and his brain invented elaborate stories to explain the pain. He finished by saying he needed coffee and counseling. It sounded like exactly the kind of dark humor he'd always used. Everyone reading it treated it like just another strange dream. No one thought anything of it. Why would they? It was only a nightmare. Then, the following night, the unimaginable happened. His room caught fire. He didn't survive. When I heard the news, my mind immediately went back to that Facebook post. I read it again. And suddenly, every sentence felt different. The dream itself didn't predict the fire. There was no evidence of that. There are rational explanations for why someone might dream about heat or flames, especially if they were already experiencing physical pain while sleeping. But the coincidence is impossible for me to ignore. One night he described, in vivid detail, what it felt like to be trapped by an unstoppable wall of fire. The very next night he died in a real fire. I know coincidences happen. The human brain naturally searches for patterns, especially after tragedies. Still, this one has always stayed with me. Not because I believe the dream was supernatural, but because of how eerily similar it was to the way his life ended. 7 years have passed, and I still think about that post from time to time. It wasn't written like someone expecting to die. It was written by someone laughing at themselves after having a terrifying nightmare. Someone planning to grab a cup of coffee and move on with their day. Reading it now feels completely different than it did that morning. It's no longer just a funny story about a bizarre dream. It's the last thing I remember him sharing with the world before he was gone. Every now and then I'll come across discussions about strange coincidences or dreams that seem unsettling in hindsight, and my mind always goes back to him. Maybe it was nothing more than chance. Maybe that's all it ever was. But I don't think I'll ever forget opening Facebook, reading about his nightmare over my morning coffee, and then learning less than 2 days later that the man who wrote it had died in a house fire. Some memories stay with you because they're tragic. Others stay with you because you can never quite make sense of them. For me, this one is both. Back in the late 1970s, my family lived on a small ranch just south of San Antonio, Texas. Life out there was quiet and predictable. Everyone knew their neighbors, and if someone needed help moving livestock or fixing a fence, people usually showed up without hesitation. One of our neighbors was a man named Frank. Frank had recently purchased a registered Brahman bull, something he was incredibly proud of. It wasn't just another animal for the herd. Registered Brahman bulls were valuable, and this one represented a significant investment. Its registered name was Cornelius. The day Cornelius arrived, Frank asked my family if we could give him a hand unloading the bull. Moving a full-grown Brahman bull isn't exactly a one-person job. They're massive, incredibly powerful animals, and even the calmest one deserves a healthy amount of respect. We spent the afternoon helping Frank unload Cornelius and guide him into a holding pen. The idea was to keep him separated from the cows for a little while, so the herd could get used to the newcomer before he was turned loose with them. Everything went smoothly. Cornelius looked healthy, strong, alert. There wasn't anything unusual about his behavior. After we finished, everyone headed home, expecting that within a day or two, he'd be out in the pasture with the rest of the cattle. The next morning, Frank came looking for us. Something about him seemed different. He looked unsettled. The first thing he asked was whether we'd seen or heard anything strange during the night. We hadn't. The ranch had been completely quiet. No gunshots, no livestock making unusual noises. Nothing. Then he told us his new bull was dead. We all walked out to the back pasture, the one that bordered our property. There, lying on his side in the grass, was Cornelius. Seeing an animal that size lying completely motionless was unsettling by itself. Brahman bulls are enormous. You don't expect to see one dead overnight without some obvious explanation. We all looked him over, trying to figure out what had happened. There was no obvious cause of death, no large wounds, no blood. No signs that he'd been attacked by another animal. The only marks anyone could find were a few shallow scratches around his neck and his hindquarters. Nothing that looked remotely serious enough to kill an animal that large. It made no sense. Back then, there wasn't anything in our part of Texas that we knew of capable of bringing down a healthy adult Brahman bull without leaving clear evidence behind. No one had an explanation. Maybe there was one. Maybe there wasn't. As far as I know, nobody ever figured out exactly why Cornelius died. The mystery might have ended there. Instead, sometime afterward, my dad told us something Frank had shared with him. According to Frank, he believed he'd seen something in that very pasture. He claimed that one night, he saw the figure of a woman. The strange part wasn't that she appeared unexpectedly. It was that she didn't have a head. Frank insisted he had seen a headless woman standing or moving somewhere out in that pasture. I never heard him tell the story myself. Everything I know came through my dad. But he believed Frank was completely serious. And there was one thing everyone agreed on. Frank wasn't known for making things up. He wasn't the kind of man who told wild stories to get attention. He also wasn't known for drinking. As far as anyone around us knew, alcohol wasn't part of his life. That didn't prove he'd actually seen anything. Of course. People can be mistaken. Our minds sometimes play tricks on us, especially in the dark. Still, whatever Frank believed he had seen affected him deeply. For the entire time my family lived there afterward, he refused to go into that pasture after dark. It didn't matter if there was work to do. It didn't matter if livestock were out there. If the sun had gone down, Frank stayed away. He also made a point of warning us. Whenever the subject came up, he'd tell us not to wander into that pasture at night. He genuinely seemed concerned. As kids, that warning got under our skin. We'd already been unsettled by the unexplained death of Cornelius. Now there was this story about a headless woman wandering the same field. Every shadow suddenly looked suspicious. Every movement in the tall grass made your imagination work overtime. Of course, none of us ever saw her. Not once. Headless, or otherwise. The pasture always looked exactly like every other pasture during the day. Just grass, fences, and cattle. At night, though, it felt different. Maybe only because of the story. Maybe because once someone plants an image like that in your mind, it's impossible not to picture it whenever you look into the darkness. Even now, decades later, I still think about Cornelius from time to time. There was probably a perfectly ordinary explanation for his death. Animals can die suddenly from illnesses, heart problems, lightning strikes, poisonous plants, or conditions that aren't immediately obvious. Without a veterinary examination, there's simply no way to know. As for Frank's story about the headless woman, I honestly don't know what he experienced. Maybe he saw something he couldn't explain. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe exhaustion, distance, and darkness combined to create something that looked far more frightening than it really was. Whatever happened, it was real enough to him that he never set foot in that pasture after sunset again. And that's the part I've never forgotten. Not because I believe there was necessarily anything supernatural out there, but because I watched a practical rancher, someone who spent his life working outdoors and wasn't known for telling tall tales, change his behavior completely after whatever he believed he had seen. Whether it was an unexplained animal death, a coincidence, or simply a story that grew over time, it certainly left an impression on everyone who heard it. Even all these years later, whenever I think about lonely ranches, empty pastures, and the silence that settles over the countryside after dark, I can't help remembering Frank, his prized bull Cornelius, and the warning he repeated every chance he got. Stay out of that pasture after dark. We listened, and none of us ever found out whether there was really anything waiting out there in the night. When I was growing up, one of my dad's closest friends had a younger brother who disappeared during a trip. It's one of those stories that stayed with my family for years, not because of how it ended, but because of how long nobody knew what had happened. It all started one evening when a group of friends were spending time together. From what I was told, his younger brother had been drinking a little. He wasn't falling over drunk or acting out of control, just tipsy enough that no one thought much of it. At some point, during the night, he wandered away from the group. No one was immediately worried. Everyone assumed he'd be back in a few minutes. Maybe he had gone to clear his head. Maybe he'd gone to use the bathroom. Maybe he'd decided to walk back to wherever they were staying. It seemed like one of those small things that happens all the time. But as the minutes turned into hours, people began to realize something wasn't right. They started calling his name. They searched the nearby area with flashlights. Friends split up to cover more ground, checking roads, trails, and anywhere they thought he might have gone. There was no sign of him. As the night wore on, the panic only grew. Not long after he disappeared, my dad received a phone call that he never forgot. His friend was frantic. At the time, my dad worked in a position that regularly put him in contact with law enforcement and emergency services. Because of that, his friend hoped he might know someone who could speed things up or organize a larger official search before too much time was lost. He wasn't asking for favors. He was simply desperate. When someone you love suddenly disappears, you'll call anyone you think might be able to help. You stop caring about pride or protocol. You just want someone to find them. My dad immediately did everything he could. Search efforts were organized. Authorities became involved. Friends, volunteers, and emergency personnel searched the surrounding area as thoroughly as they could. Everyone believed the same thing. Surely they'd find him. Maybe he'd become disoriented. Maybe he'd injured himself and couldn't get back. Maybe he was simply lost. No one imagined that this search would continue for years. The days passed with no answers. Then weeks. Then months. Eventually, the months became years. There were no confirmed sightings, no evidence of foul play, no belongings, nothing to explain where he'd gone or what had happened that night. It was as though he had simply vanished. For his family, life never truly returned to normal. People often assume that after enough time passes, families somehow learn to move on. From everything my dad witnessed, that's not how it works when there's no answer. Without certainty, hope refuses to die. Every unidentified body reported in the news becomes a possibility. Every phone call makes your heart race. Every rumor feels like it could finally be the breakthrough you've been waiting for. You live in a strange place between hope and grief. My dad watched his friend's family slowly change over the years. The uncertainty weighed on every part of their lives. Birthdays became painful reminders. Holidays were never complete. Family gatherings always had one empty place that no one could ignore. Instead of grieving, they were trapped, waiting for answers that never came. Time moved forward for everyone else. For them, it felt as though it had stopped on the night he disappeared. Then, after many years, whether it was around 12 years or closer to 20, I honestly can't remember exactly, the mystery was finally solved. His remains were discovered at the bottom of an old well. The discovery answered the question everyone had been asking for years. Where had he gone? Investigators found no evidence that anyone had placed him there. There were no signs of violence, no indication that another person had been involved. Everything pointed toward a heartbreaking accident. That night, after having a few drinks, He had apparently been walking through the darkness. He likely never even realized the well was there. One wrong step. 1 second of bad luck. And he fell. It wasn't murder. It wasn't a kidnapping. It wasn't some elaborate mystery that would eventually be solved by detectives. It was simply a tragic accident that no one could have imagined at the time. Because no one knew where to search, his family spent years believing almost anything was possible. As devastating as the truth was, it finally brought an end to the uncertainty. At least they finally knew. Even so, I've often found myself thinking about what those last moments might have been like. I genuinely hope the fall killed him instantly. The alternative is almost unbearable to imagine. The thought of surviving the fall, waking up injured at the bottom of a deep well, calling for help that no one could hear, and slowly realizing no one was coming, that's a terrifying thought. It's one I try not to dwell on. What has stayed with me most over the years, though, isn't actually the discovery. It's what happened the night my dad got that phone call. After everything was over, he and his friends sat together for hours talking, not just about the disappearance, but about life itself. About how fragile our lives really are. About how quickly everything can change. One ordinary evening can become the dividing line between two completely different lives. Before that night, his friend had a younger brother. After that night, he had only questions. Sometimes, when people disappear, our minds naturally imagine complicated explanations. We think about kidnappings, murders, serial killers, conspiracies. Those possibilities capture our attention because they're dramatic. But sometimes the truth is far simpler, and somehow, even more heartbreaking. Sometimes it's just darkness. One hidden hazard, one unfortunate decision, one accidental step in the wrong direction. A tragedy that leaves almost no evidence behind and no witnesses to explain what happened. To me, that's what makes this story so unsettling. It reminds us that life doesn't always change because of something evil. Sometimes, it changes because of a single accident that no one could have predicted. Even now, whenever I hear about someone who has vanished without a trace, I think back to this story. Not because every missing person meets the same fate. Most cases are different. But because it reminds me that behind every missing person's poster is a family living with endless uncertainty. They're left wondering where their loved one is, what happened to them, and whether they'll ever get an answer. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. And sometimes, the truth is as simple and as devastating as one unnoticed well in the darkness, waiting for someone who never saw it coming. When I was growing up, one of my dad's close friends had a younger brother who disappeared during a trip. It happened at night. From what I was told, he'd had a few drinks, but nobody thought he was in any real danger. At some point, he simply wandered away from the group. Then he was gone. At first, everyone assumed he'd turn up before long. Maybe he'd gotten lost. Maybe he decided to walk back on his own. Maybe he'd fallen asleep somewhere. As the hours passed, though, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. Not long after he disappeared, my dad got a frantic phone call from his friend. My dad's job at the time had put him in contact with law enforcement and emergency services, so his friend hoped he might be able to help. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He was desperate. He wanted to know if my dad could contact higher-level authorities, organize an official search, or get more resources involved before valuable time was lost. When someone you love vanishes without a trace, you reach out to anyone who might be able to help. My dad did what he could. Search efforts were launched. People looked everywhere they could think of. Friends, volunteers, and investigators all hoped the same thing, that he would simply be found alive and confused somewhere nearby. But he wasn't. Days turned into weeks. Weeks became months. Eventually, months turned into years. There were no answers, no sightings, no evidence explaining what had happened. He had simply vanished. For his family, life never really moved forward. People often think that after enough time passes, families somehow find peace. From everything my dad witnessed, that isn't how it works. Without answers, hope and grief exist side by side. Every phone call could be the one. Every unidentified person could be them. Every rumor becomes something you can't completely ignore. My dad watched his friend's family slowly fall apart under the weight of not knowing. Year after year, they lived with unanswered questions. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. Life kept moving for everyone else. For them, it felt as though time had stopped on the night he disappeared. Eventually, after many years, whether it was around 12 years or closer to 20, I honestly can't remember exactly. The mystery was finally solved. His body was discovered at the bottom of an old well. It wasn't hidden there. There was no evidence of foul play. From everything the investigation concluded, the explanation was tragically simple. On the night he disappeared, he'd apparently been walking in the dark after having a few drinks. He likely never saw the well. One wrong step, one moment of bad luck, he walked straight into it. It wasn't a murder. It wasn't a kidnapping. It wasn't some elaborate mystery. Just a devastating accident that remained unexplained for years because no one knew where to look. As heartbreaking as that realization was, it also answered the question that had haunted everyone for so long. The uncertainty was finally over. Still, I can't help thinking about those final moments. I sincerely hope he died from the impact of the fall. The alternative is almost impossible to imagine. The thought of surviving the fall, only to find yourself trapped at the bottom of a deep well, unable to climb out or call for help, is terrifying. It's one of those possibilities I'd rather not think about. What has always stayed with me most, though, isn't the discovery itself. It's my dad. I remember him talking about that phone call. I remember how deeply it affected him. That night, after learning what had happened, he and his friends sat together for hours talking about life, chance, and how unbelievably fragile everything really is. Sometimes we spend years imagining the worst possible explanations for a disappearance. We picture crimes, conspiracies, runaways, things that make sense because they involve choices. But sometimes the truth is something far crueler. An ordinary accident, a hidden danger, one wrong step in the dark, a tragedy that leaves no witnesses and almost no clues. It's frightening because it reminds you how little separates an ordinary evening from a lifetime of unanswered questions. To this day, whenever I hear about someone who has disappeared without a trace, I think back to that story. Not because every missing person meets the same fate, but because sometimes the answer isn't complicated at all. Sometimes it's heartbreakingly simple. One unfortunate moment, one accident no one saw, and a family left searching for years, wondering where someone they loved had gone, until the truth is finally uncovered far too late. I went to a school that had a strict uniform policy, so if you needed a new shirt, trousers, blazer, or pretty much anything else, you bought it from the school shop. Inside the shop was a small changing room where students could try on uniforms before buying them. Like most kids, I never gave it a second thought. The man who ran the shop seemed completely ordinary. He was always there behind the counter, selling school supplies along with the uniforms. If you needed a pen, an eraser, a notebook, or a replacement tie, he'd hand it over with a smile. He was friendly enough that nobody really questioned him. He was just part of everyday school life. Then one day, everything changed. Word spread that he'd been arrested. The allegations were horrifying. He had reportedly been arrested for child sexual abuse offenses. And there were claims that he'd hidden a camera inside the changing room where students tried on their uniforms. I don't know every detail of the investigation or exactly what evidence was ultimately presented in court, but hearing those allegations completely changed the way I remembered that place. Personally, I rarely used the changing room. I almost always bought my uniforms without trying them on. Men's and boys' clothing sizes were usually predictable enough that I'd simply buy the next size up as I grew. It almost always fit. At the time, I did it because it was quicker and easier. Looking back, I realize I probably spent very little time in that room, if any, but that's not what still bothers me. What I think about are the girls I grew up with, the classmates I'd known since we were little kids. Some of them I'd been in school with since we were 2 or 3 years old. Over the years, they all used that changing room. Not just once, but again and again. As children, as teenagers, as they gradually grew into young adults. It was just part of buying a school uniform. Nobody thought twice about it. That's the part that still unsettles me. If those allegations were true, then what should have been one of the safest places in a school became somewhere their privacy may have been violated without them ever knowing. It's an awful thing to think about. How many students might have been affected? How many families had absolutely no idea? How many ordinary afternoons spent buying school clothes became something much darker without anyone realizing it? Those questions have never really left me. What makes it even harder to process is how completely normal the man seemed. He wasn't some stranger lurking outside the school gates. He wasn't someone parents warned their children about. He worked inside the school environment. Students saw him all the time. Parents trusted him. Teachers knew him. He was just the quiet guy behind the counter who sold stationery and uniforms. I can still picture walking into the shop to buy a pen or an eraser. We'd have short conversations. Nothing about him ever stood out as unusual. That's one of the most disturbing things about cases like this. People often imagine dangerous individuals as looking or acting obviously suspicious. In reality, many present themselves as perfectly ordinary. That's often how they gain people's trust in the first place. Every now and then, I think about my old classmates. I wonder whether any of them were contacted during the investigation, whether they ever found out, whether they had to live with the possibility that images of them had been recorded without their knowledge while they were simply trying on school uniforms. Even if nothing was ever recovered, the possibility alone is deeply unsettling. It changes the way you remember a place that once felt completely ordinary. For me, the school shop used to be nothing more than somewhere to replace a worn-out tie or buy another exercise book. Now, whenever I think back on it, I don't picture the shelves or the uniforms. I picture that small changing room. A place where generations of students expected privacy. And I think about how something as routine as trying on a school shirt could have been turned into an unimaginable violation of trust if the allegations were true. More than anything, it reminds me how profoundly betrayal can affect a community. When someone in a position of trust is accused of exploiting children, the damage extends far beyond the direct victims. It reaches classmates, parents, teachers, and anyone who later realizes that ordinary memories may have had a much darker reality hidden beneath them. That's what still stays with me all these years later. Not the arrest itself, not the headlines, just the realization that the same man who calmly handed me a pen or an eraser after school was also the person so many students and parents trusted without hesitation. And if the allegations were true, that trust was betrayed in the worst possible way. When I was around 13 years old, my best friend and I had started hanging around with a group of older boys. Looking back, they were probably a little too old for us to be spending time with, but at that age we thought they were the coolest people in the world. Every now and then, they'd pile everyone into a car and drive around the back roads outside our suburb. Most of the places they took us were heavily wooded, connected by long unpaved roads that seemed to go on forever. Once you left the neighborhoods behind, it felt like you were in the middle of nowhere. One particular road always stood out. Whenever we drove down it, the mood inside the car changed. The joking stopped. The older guys became noticeably quieter. One of them would eventually point farther down the road and tell us that if we kept driving, you'd eventually pass through a Ku Klux Klan camp. As kids, my friend and I didn't know what to believe. It sounded like the kind of scary story older teenagers tell younger kids just to freak them out. One of the boys even said we'd probably be fine because we were white. Whether that claim was actually true or just another part of the story, I have no idea. At the time, we simply accepted it as another frightening warning. But then the conversation would continue. They'd say that if you drove even farther, you'd eventually reach another place. And that place, they insisted, was somewhere no girl should ever go alone, ever. According to them, terrible things happened there. Really terrible things. They called it Piggy's Palace. The way they described it made it sound almost mythical, like one of those places surrounded by rumors that everyone had heard about but nobody wanted to visit. My best friend and I assumed they were trying to scare us. Teenagers loved telling younger kids creepy stories, and we figured this was probably another one of those. Still, something always stuck with me. One of the older boys wasn't laughing. He wasn't trying to build suspense or entertain anyone. Whenever Piggy's Palace came up, his voice became serious. Completely serious. It was the kind of tone people use when they genuinely don't want you to make a certain mistake. Even as a 13-year-old, I remember noticing the difference. For years afterward, I occasionally thought about that road and those strange warnings. Life moved on. I grew up. The memory became just another odd story from childhood. Then, roughly 30 years later, I heard something that stopped me cold. The place we'd been warned about all those years earlier wasn't just the subject of local rumors. It was real. Piggy's Palace was the name associated with Robert Picton's farm in British Columbia, a property that became infamous during one of Canada's most disturbing serial murder investigations. As investigators uncovered what had happened there, the old conversations from my childhood suddenly came rushing back. Robert Picton was eventually convicted of murdering multiple women, while investigators believed the total number of victims could have been much higher. Many of the women who disappeared were vulnerable, including sex workers and women struggling with addiction from Vancouver's downtown East Side. The investigation revealed horrifying allegations about what had taken place on the property over many years. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case involved evidence that some victims' remains had been fed to pigs or otherwise disposed of on the farm, contributing to the property's grim reputation. Hearing those details decades later completely changed how I remembered those childhood warnings. As a kid, I'd assumed the older boys were exaggerating. Now I realized they may have been repeating local rumors that existed long before the crimes became public knowledge. Rumors often grow around places where people sense something is wrong, even if they don't know exactly why. Whether those boys knew anything firsthand, had heard stories from adults, or were simply repeating local gossip, I'll never know. Looking back now, it's unsettling to think that there may have been whispers circulating in the community years before the full truth came to light. The more I learned about the case, the more disturbing it became. Investigators later alleged that women were brought to the property under false pretenses, and testimony during the investigation painted a picture of a place where vulnerable people were exploited and disappeared. There have also been long-standing questions about whether Robert Pickton acted entirely alone. Various witnesses, investigators, and commentators have suggested that others may have had knowledge of or involvement in criminal activity connected to the farm. However, many of those claims were never proven in court, and the full extent of what happened remains a subject of debate. What is certain is that Pickton was convicted of murdering 6 women, although investigators believed many more victims may have been connected to the case. When I think back to those drives now, I remember how innocent my friend and I were. We rolled our eyes. We laughed. We thought the older boys were trying to scare us with ghost stories about places hidden deep in the woods. Instead, it seems they may have been passing along warnings that had circulated quietly for years. As children, we couldn't possibly understand what those warnings might have meant. To us, Piggy's Palace was just another strange name attached to another creepy story. Now, it's remembered as one of the darkest crime scenes in Canadian history. Every once in a while, I think about that one older boy who always became serious whenever the place was mentioned. At the time, I thought he was just a better storyteller than everyone else. Now I wonder if he had heard enough rumors growing up to know there was something genuinely dangerous about that road. Whatever the truth was, one thing has stayed with me all these years. Sometimes the stories adults dismiss as local legends or exaggerated gossip have a small piece of truth hidden inside them. Most don't. But every now and then, decades later, you discover that the place everyone warned you to avoid wasn't just a scary story after all. If you're adapting these for a USA, UK, Canada audience, this version keeps the facts grounded, avoids presenting unproven allegations as certainty, improves the flow, and stays close to the original while making it much more immersive. The murders at the Ryan family home remain one of the most disturbing and controversial criminal cases in California history. On the morning of June 5, 1983, Bill Hughes drove to a semi-rural home in Chino Hills, California, expecting to pick up his 11-year-old son, Christopher, who had spent the night there with his best friend. Instead, he walked into a nightmare. Inside the house, he discovered the bodies of Douglas Ryan, his wife Peggy, their 10-year-old daughter Jessica, and Christopher Hughes. All 4 had been brutally murdered. The attack had been extraordinarily violent. Investigators determined the victims had suffered multiple forms of assault, including injuries from a hatchet, knife wounds, and puncture wounds consistent with an ice pick. The level of violence shocked even experienced investigators. Miraculously, 1 child had survived. 8-year-old Josh Ryan, Douglas and Peggy's youngest son, was found critically injured. His throat had been cut so severely that investigators initially believed he could not have survived. Yet somehow, despite his devastating injuries, he was still alive when help arrived. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors fought to save his life. Against overwhelming odds, he survived. As detectives began processing the crime scene, They immediately noticed something unusual. Peggy Ryan's purse was sitting openly on the kitchen counter. Money and other valuables had been left behind. If robbery had been the motive, it appeared the killer had ignored obvious opportunities to steal. That immediately complicated the investigation. The only major item missing from the property was the family's station wagon. Investigators believed the killer, or killers, had used it to flee the scene. Several days later, the vehicle was located abandoned in Long Beach, roughly 50 miles southwest of Chino Hills. Finding the car answered one question, but created many others. Why had it been driven so far away? Who had abandoned it? Were there clues inside that could identify the person responsible? As the investigation continued, detectives searched for anything that could explain why an entire family had been targeted with such extraordinary violence. There was no obvious motive, no clear evidence of a burglary gone wrong, no immediate suspect. The brutality of the murders, combined with the apparent lack of theft, made the crime even more difficult to understand. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the case was Josh Ryan. Despite surviving one of the most horrific attacks imaginable, he had lost nearly his entire family in a single night. His parents were gone. His sister was gone. His best friend was gone. He was left as the sole survivor of a crime that would later become the subject of years of investigation, controversy, and legal debate. As Josh recovered, investigators hoped he might eventually be able to provide information about what had happened inside the house. His recollections, along with the physical evidence collected at the scene, would become an important part of an investigation that ultimately led to one of California's most debated murder convictions. Over the decades, the Chino Hills murders have remained in the public spotlight because of continuing disputes surrounding the investigation and prosecution that followed. Supporters of convicted inmate Kevin Cooper have argued that evidence pointing to multiple perpetrators and other investigative issues were overlooked or mishandled, while courts have repeatedly upheld Cooper's conviction after extensive appeals. The case continues to generate debate, with advocates, investigators, and legal experts holding sharply different views about whether the right person was convicted. Regardless of where people stand on that controversy, one fact is beyond dispute. On a quiet Sunday morning in June 1983, 4 innocent people, including 2 children, lost their lives in an attack of unimaginable violence, while an 8-year-old boy survived injuries that should have been fatal. More than 4 decades later, the horror of what happened inside that Chino Hills home continues to haunt everyone who has studied the case, making it one of the most unforgettable and controversial murder investigations in modern California history. Back in the late 1980s, there was a story that has stayed with me ever since. Not because I witnessed the events myself, but because I was close enough to someone who became personally involved in the aftermath. I didn't know the woman at the center of it. One of my colleagues did. They had attended university together, and from everything he ever said about her, she was exactly the kind of person you would expect to work in a highly sensitive government position. She was intelligent, calm, exceptionally responsible. The sort of person who followed every rule to the letter. According to him, she was one of the most ethical people he'd ever met. He couldn't imagine her deliberately breaking even a minor regulation, let alone violating the strict security procedures that came with working in a classified government laboratory. She was employed by CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, and worked in a federal laboratory where the research was reportedly highly classified. Exactly what she worked on wasn't something anyone outside her immediate circle ever knew. Then, one day, everything changed. While at work, she suddenly became violently ill. Her condition deteriorated quickly enough that she required emergency medical attention. She wasn't transported by an ordinary civilian ambulance. Instead, military medical personnel reportedly took her to the hospital. Even before she arrived, it was obvious this wasn't going to be handled like a normal medical emergency. Once at the hospital, doctors immediately began trying to determine what had caused her condition. According to the account that eventually reached my colleague, she admitted she had intentionally taken something in an attempt to end her life. She reportedly told the medical staff that whatever she had swallowed wasn't working as quickly as she had expected. Naturally, the doctors asked the obvious question: what had she taken? Her answer only made the situation more alarming. She admitted the substance had come from the classified laboratory where she worked, but she refused to identify it. She would not tell the doctors its name. She would not describe its chemical properties. She would not explain how much she had taken. She only insisted that no one else was in danger because of what she had done. That was all she was willing to say. Members of CSIS had accompanied her to the hospital. According to the story my colleague later heard, they remained there because of the classified nature of her work and whatever material she had reportedly removed from the laboratory. The medical staff then turned to them. If the patient wouldn't identify the substance, surely the government representatives could. After all, laboratory inventory records would presumably show exactly what materials were missing. Instead, they reportedly refused. According to the account I heard, they acknowledged that internal records would very likely reveal what she had ingested. However, they maintained that national security obligations prevented them from disclosing that information. They would not tell the doctors. They would not release the records. And they reportedly would not cooperate beyond confirming that the situation involved classified material. If that account is accurate, it placed the physicians in an almost impossible position. Doctors rely on knowing what poison, chemical, or medication a patient has taken. Without that information, treatment often becomes little more than educated guesswork. Every minute matters. Yet the very information that might have guided treatment was allegedly being withheld. As her condition worsened, extraordinary precautions were reportedly put in place. She was moved into an isolation room. Military guards were assigned outside her door. Access became heavily restricted. The security measures didn't stop with hospital staff. According to what my colleague later learned, even her immediate family was denied access. Her husband reportedly wasn't allowed to enter the room. Neither were her parents. They couldn't sit beside her. They couldn't speak with her. They couldn't even say goodbye. Hours passed. Despite the efforts of the medical team, she eventually died. Even in her final hours, she reportedly never revealed exactly what substance she had taken. The only reassurance she continued to offer was that no one else would be harmed by what she had done. That statement has always struck me as oddly compassionate, considering the circumstances. Whatever her reasons, she apparently wanted the people around her to know they weren't in danger. Everything that happened afterward became even more difficult to understand. The reason I know about this story at all is because of my colleague. On the day all of this unfolded, he received an unexpected phone call. It was from the woman's husband. He wasn't calling simply to tell an old friend what had happened. He was desperately looking for legal help. According to my colleague, the husband wanted to force either the hospital or the government, or both, to allow him to see his wife before she died. He was frantic. Unfortunately, my colleague wasn't the right person for that kind of legal matter. He had no expertise in national security law or emergency injunctions. As much as he wanted to help, the only thing he could do was refer him to another lawyer who might have experience in that area. I remember how shaken my colleague was after hanging up the phone. He wasn't only upset by the apparent suicide attempt. He couldn't reconcile it with the person he thought he knew. He kept repeating that this simply wasn't something she would have done, not because he believed she couldn't struggle personally, but because deliberately removing a classified substance from a secure government laboratory would itself have been an extraordinary breach of every rule she had lived by. He found that almost as shocking as her apparent decision to take her own life. The woman he remembered from university had been meticulous about doing the right thing. Breaking security protocols of that magnitude seemed completely out of character. According to what eventually circulated afterward, the family's ordeal didn't end with her death. The reports my colleague heard claimed that her body was taken into government custody. It was allegedly cremated at an undisclosed government facility. The ashes, according to those accounts, were never returned to her husband or parents. Nor were they reportedly told exactly what became of her remains. I have never been able to independently verify every detail of what happened after her death. Some aspects of the story have always sounded almost unbelievable. At the same time, I have no reason to doubt that my colleague genuinely received that desperate phone call from her husband. I was there when it happened. I saw how deeply it affected him. He wasn't someone prone to exaggeration or conspiracy theories. If anything, he was one of the most practical people I've ever known. Whether every detail that followed was completely accurate, partly misunderstood, or altered over time through retelling, I honestly can't say. What I can say is that the emotional impact on the people connected to her was very real. Whenever I think back on the story, it isn't the secrecy that stays with me most. It's the image of a husband desperately trying to find a lawyer because he simply wanted permission to stand beside his dying wife. Whether or not every reported detail was exactly as later described, that's the part I've never forgotten. This version keeps the original account intact while making it smoother, easier to read, and clearly distinguishing reported claims from established facts where the details cannot be independently verified. A long time ago, back in the mid-1990s, I worked as a countryside ranger on the West Coast. A big part of my job involved spending entire days hiking through remote woodland, surveying habitats, checking on wildlife, and documenting the condition of different areas. Most days were quiet. You'd spend hours without seeing another person. Just forests, streams, birds, and the occasional deer. After a while, you get used to the feeling of being completely alone. One day I was carrying out a Phase 1 habitat survey in a stretch of unmanaged woodland. It wasn't a place that attracted many visitors. There were no maintained trails, no campsites, and very few reasons for anyone to wander that far into the trees. As I made my way through the woods, something caught my eye. At first, I thought someone had recently been camping there. Tucked away among the trees was a small campsite. There was a tent, a camping stove, a kettle, cooking pots, a rucksack, a sleeping bag still lying inside the tent. Near the entrance sat a pair of walking boots. Each boot still had a sock tucked neatly inside it. For a brief moment, it looked as though whoever owned the camp had simply stepped away for a short walk and would be back at any minute. Then, I looked a little closer. The tent wasn't just old, it was falling apart. The fabric had become ripped and weathered after years of exposure to the elements. The cooking pots were filled with pine needles. Thick moss had slowly grown over much of the equipment. Everything had the faded, neglected appearance of something that had been abandoned for a very long time. Nature had been quietly reclaiming the campsite. It hadn't been sitting there for days, or even weeks. It had likely been there for years. That realization completely changed the atmosphere. Instead of stumbling across an active campsite, I had found what felt like a frozen moment from someone else's life. The sleeping bag was still there. The stove was still there. The kettle remained exactly where it had been left. The boots were still waiting outside the tent. It looked as though someone had simply stood up, walked away, and never returned. I began looking more carefully through the campsite, hoping to find something that might explain who had stayed there. Inside the rucksack were a few personal belongings and some clothing. Oddly enough, there was also a flute. That detail has always stayed with me. For some reason, finding a musical instrument made the whole place feel even more personal. It reminded me that this wasn't just an abandoned collection of camping gear. Someone had lived here, at least for a while. Someone had carried that flute into the woods. Maybe they played it while sitting outside the tent in the evenings. Maybe it had been one of their favorite possessions. Whatever the reason, they'd left it behind. I searched the rucksack carefully for anything that could identify its owner. A wallet, a driver's license, a notebook, letters, anything. There was nothing. No identification, no documents. Nothing that told us who the person was or where they had come from. Once I reported the discovery, it quickly became more than just an unusual find. The police became involved. A search of the surrounding area was organized. Search dogs were brought in. Local volunteers helped. Mountain Rescue joined the effort. Together, everyone combed through the nearby woodland, looking for any sign that might explain what had happened. We searched for days. Then, weeks. Every possibility was considered. If someone had become injured nearby, perhaps we'd find remains or discarded equipment. If they'd wandered off the trails, maybe there would be clothing or footprints preserved somewhere. If there had been an accident, surely something would eventually turn up. Nothing did. Not a single trace. No remains. No personal belongings beyond what had already been found. No clues pointing in any direction. It was as though the person who had lived in that little campsite had simply disappeared. Years working outdoors teach you that nature can hide an astonishing amount. Dense woodland doesn't easily give up its secrets. Animals, weather, and time gradually erase evidence until entire stories vanish beneath leaves, moss, and undergrowth. Still, this felt different. Everything important had been left behind. The sleeping bag, the cooking equipment, the rucksack, the boots, even the flute. People don't usually abandon everything they own without a reason. And yet there was no obvious explanation. Over the years, I've found myself wondering about that unknown camper more times than I can count. Who were they? Had they chosen to live alone in those woods for a while? Were they simply passing through? Had they become lost? Had they suffered some kind of accident far from the campsite? Or had they intentionally walked away, leaving everything behind? I'll never know. No one ever did. What unsettles me most isn't the possibility of any particular ending. It's the image that remains frozen in my memory. A quiet campsite deep in forgotten woodland. A tent slowly collapsing under years of rain and wind. Cooking pots filled with fallen pine needles. Green moss spreading across forgotten equipment. A pair of walking boots sitting patiently outside the entrance, each one still holding a sock exactly where it had been left. And inside a weathered rucksack, a flute. For some reason, it's always the flute that stays with me. Camping equipment can be replaced. Clothes wear out. Boots eventually fall apart, but a musical instrument feels deeply personal. People often carry them because music matters to them. It makes you wonder what songs that person might have played while sitting alone among those trees. It makes the unknown owner feel real. Not just another missing person. A human being with hobbies, routines, and a life beyond that forgotten campsite. Every now and then, I still think about that survey. Out of all the wildlife, landscapes, and routine inspections I carried out during my years as a ranger, that's the memory that has never faded. Not because of what I found, but because of what I didn't. There was no ending, no explanation, no answers. Just the silent remains of a life, interrupted, sitting untouched beneath the trees while the forest slowly reclaimed everything. Sometimes people imagine mysteries have dramatic conclusions. Bodies are found. Missing people are identified. Families finally get answers. This wasn't one of those stories. The search ended. The weeks passed. The woods remained quiet. And somewhere, the story of the person who once slept in that tent simply disappeared. To this day, I still wonder what happened to the person who packed a rucksack, carried a flute into the woods, built a small camp in the middle of nowhere, and one day walked away from it forever, leaving every trace of themselves behind, except the mystery. When I was stationed in Iwakuni, Japan, I had an additional responsibility besides my regular duties. I was the safety enco for our unit, which meant that whenever an accident happened, I was responsible for completing the reports and documenting exactly what had taken place. Most of the time, it was routine, minor injuries, training incidents. Nothing that stayed with you for very long. I never imagined I'd one day be filling out paperwork for someone I'd been laughing and drinking with only a couple of days earlier. There was a Marine I knew through work. We weren't especially close friends, but we knew each other well enough to hang out whenever a group got together. One Thursday evening, several of us went out for drinks. It was just a normal night. Nothing memorable happened. We talked, joked around, had a few drinks, and eventually everyone went their separate ways. If someone had told me that would be the last time I'd ever see him alive, I never would have believed it. 2 days later, on Saturday, he and 2 other Marines decided to rent a canoe and spend some time out on the water. From everything I later learned, it was supposed to be nothing more than a relaxing day. They headed out into the ocean, expecting to enjoy a few hours paddling around before returning to shore. At some point, though, something went wrong. The canoe overturned. Suddenly, all 3 men were in the water. Instead of sitting safely inside the canoe, they found themselves clinging to the upside-down hull, stranded offshore. For a while, they stayed together, holding on to the overturned canoe while trying to figure out what to do. Eventually, they reached a decision. The strongest swimmer would leave the canoe and try to swim back to shore to get help. The other 2 would remain where they were, holding onto the canoe until rescuers arrived. On paper, it probably seemed like the best option they had. The strongest swimmer set off toward land. The remaining 2 stayed behind. Eventually, the swimmer reached shore and was able to alert authorities. Rescue efforts began. Sometime afterward, the second Marine also left the canoe. Fortunately, he was spotted by local fishermen who pulled him from the water alive. My friend wasn't as lucky. He stayed with the overturned canoe. At some point, rescue teams lost track of him. A search operation was launched along the coastline. They searched the surrounding waters and shoreline, hoping to find him alive. Instead, they eventually recovered his body. The cause of death wasn't drowning. It was hypothermia. That shocked me. This happened around May, and I remember thinking the weather hadn't seemed particularly cold. The ocean certainly didn't look dangerous. From what I recall, the water temperature was somewhere in the low 60s Fahrenheit. Before that incident, I honestly believed hypothermia was something that only happened in freezing water. I assumed you'd have to fall into icy lakes or snowmelt rivers for something like that to happen. I was completely wrong. As part of my responsibilities as the unit's safety NCO, I had to complete the official incident report. That meant reading through the details of what had happened. It meant documenting the timeline. It meant reviewing the conditions that contributed to his death. There's something surreal about filling out paperwork for someone you were sharing drinks with less than 48 hours earlier. One moment, they're just another guy in the unit. The next, they're a case file. One of the things I learned while completing that report has stayed with me ever since. Cold water doesn't have to feel freezing to become deadly. Even water in the 60s or 70s can gradually rob the human body of heat much faster than most people realize. People often focus on drowning as the primary danger in open water. Hypothermia can be just as deadly. As your body loses heat, your muscles weaken. Swimming becomes harder. Your coordination deteriorates. Eventually, even strong swimmers can lose the ability to keep themselves afloat. That knowledge permanently changed the way I look at water. The incident affected me in another way, too. Long before I joined the military, I used to have recurring nightmares as a child. They weren't about sharks or sea monsters exactly. They were stranger than that. In the dreams, I'd find myself floating in vast, open water. Somewhere beneath me, enormous shapeless creatures would begin moving through the darkness. I could never clearly see them. I just knew they were there. I'd try desperately to escape while something massive rose toward me from below. Almost every time, I'd wake up just as enormous jaws were about to close around me. They were some of the most vivid nightmares I ever had growing up. For years, I thought they were simply weird childhood dreams. After my friend's death, those old fears came rushing back. Except now, they weren't just dreams anymore. Now I had a real memory connected to open water. A place that looked calm on the surface had taken someone I knew. Since then, I've developed something I never really had before. Thalassophobia, a fear of deep, open water. Some people assume it's just a fear of sharks. For me, it isn't. It's the overwhelming emptiness, the endless depth. The knowledge that water can become deadly without looking dangerous. Standing on a beach is one thing. Looking out over an ocean where you can't see the bottom is something entirely different. Whenever I look across open water now, I think about how quickly situations can change. One overturned canoe. One unexpected accident. A few hours later, someone is gone. The ocean doesn't need towering waves or dramatic storms to become lethal. Sometimes all it takes is cold water and time. Looking back, what stays with me most isn't the search or even the report I had to complete. It's Thursday night, sitting around with a group of Marines, laughing over drinks like we'd done plenty of times before. None of us had any reason to think one of those conversations would be our last. By Saturday, he was missing. Shortly afterward, I found myself documenting the circumstances of his death. That's a strange feeling I'll probably never be able to fully describe. It teaches you just how quickly ordinary life can change. One day, you're making weekend plans with someone. The next, you're writing their name into an official report explaining how they died. Ever since then, I've never been able to look at open water the same way. I don't just see the ocean anymore. I see how deceptively calm it can appear, even while quietly becoming one of the most unforgiving environments a person can find themselves in. And every now and then, when I stand near a large body of water and look out toward the horizon, those old childhood nightmares still come back. Not because I believe there's something lurking beneath the surface, but because I now understand that sometimes the greatest danger is the one you never see at all. When I was a kid, I used to ride my bike across the neighborhood almost every chance I got. One of my closest friends lived on the other side of the subdivision, so after school or on weekends I'd pedal over to his house to hang out. His name was Blake. At the time, he was just another neighborhood kid to me. We played outside, rode bikes, messed around with whatever hobbies we happened to be interested in, and did all the normal things kids do. Looking back, there were moments that probably should have stood out to me. But when you're young, you don't usually recognize warning signs for what they are. One afternoon, I was riding down a hill toward his house like I had done dozens of times before. Without warning, Blake jumped out from behind a power pole right next to the street. He scared me so badly that I instinctively jerked the handlebars. I completely lost control of my bike. The next thing I knew, I was sliding across the pavement. Both of my forearms scraped against the road, peeling away skin for several inches on each arm. It hurt badly. I remember sitting there stunned, looking at the road rash covering both arms. What surprised me wasn't just the crash. It was Blake's reaction. Instead of apologizing for startling me, he somehow made it seem like it was my fault. As strange as that sounds now, I actually accepted it. Kids are funny that way. Sometimes another child says something with enough confidence that you simply assume they're right. I don't remember arguing with him. I just brushed it off and kept hanging out. Not long after that, he managed to get his hands on some firecrackers. Specifically, M80s. Like a couple of kids who thought explosions were entertaining, we spent time blowing things up. We destroyed an old model airplane just to see what would happen. At the time, it seemed like the sort of reckless but fairly common thing kids sometimes do. Then he casually mentioned another idea. He talked about using the firecrackers to blow up frogs. I honestly didn't believe he was serious. I figured he was just trying to sound tough or shock me. Kids say ridiculous things all the time, and I assumed this was one of those moments. I never actually saw him do it. As far as I knew, it was just talk. Eventually, life moved on. We grew up. Like most childhood friendships, ours slowly faded as we got older. After high school, I heard that Blake had joined the United States Marine Corps. That didn't seem particularly unusual. A lot of people from our area enlisted after graduation. At some point, I learned he hadn't re-enlisted after finishing his service. Other than that, I really didn't think much about him anymore. Years passed. One day, I was at home when my mom was reading the newspaper. She suddenly looked up and asked me a question. She wanted to know the full name of the boy I used to ride bikes with all the time. I told her. She looked back down at the paper. Then she told me he had been arrested. At first, I assumed it had to be something minor. Maybe a fight. Maybe drugs. Maybe some kind of theft. Instead, she told me he had been arrested for murdering his estranged girlfriend. She was also pregnant. According to investigators, he had driven her car off the highway onto a secluded dirt road. There, prosecutors said he cut her throat before setting the vehicle on fire, using containers of fuel in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence. I remember feeling completely numb while listening. This wasn't someone I had heard about on television. This wasn't a stranger from another state. This was the same kid I'd spent afternoons riding bikes with. The same kid I'd considered a friend. As I learned more about the case, I discovered that investigators had located him not long after the crime. From what I remember, he was reportedly walking away from the area when a police officer stopped to question him. At some point during the investigation, he confessed. He was ultimately convicted of murdering both his estranged girlfriend and her unborn child. I don't remember every detail of the investigation anymore. What I do remember is the overwhelming feeling of disbelief. When someone you knew as a child commits a crime like that, your mind automatically starts searching backward through old memories. You replay moments that never seemed important before. You start asking yourself questions. Were there warning signs? Was there something I should have noticed? Or is that only obvious now, because I know how the story ended? I always come back to those childhood memories. The bike crash. The complete lack of concern after I got hurt. The casual conversation about blowing up frogs with explosives. At the time, none of those things convinced me I was spending time with someone dangerous. Kids can be insensitive. Kids sometimes enjoy gross or destructive things. Children don't always understand empathy the way adults do. If you'd asked me back then whether Blake would one day become a convicted murderer, I would have laughed at the idea. Nothing in my mind connected those moments to something that horrific. Looking back now, though, it's impossible not to wonder whether they were small glimpses of a personality that would become much darker over time. Of course, it's also important to be careful about hindsight. Many children say shocking things or behave recklessly without ever becoming violent adults. Most don't. Knowing how Blake's life ultimately unfolded naturally changes the way I remember those moments, even if they didn't necessarily predict what he would eventually do. Still, those memories have never left me. It's strange how ordinary childhood experiences can suddenly take on completely different meanings years later. One minute you're remembering riding bicycles around the neighborhood. The next, you're reading about someone you once called a friend being convicted of a double murder. That kind of news changes the way you look at your own memories. It makes you question how well we ever truly know the people around us. As kids, we usually judge our friends by simple things. Who wants to ride bikes? Who likes the same games? Who's fun to spend time with after school? We don't have the experience to recognize traits that adults might find concerning. We certainly don't imagine that someone sitting beside us blowing up old toys with firecrackers could one day be capable of taking another person's life. Even now, years later, that's probably the part that unsettles me the most. Not that I knew a murderer, but that, for a period of my childhood, he was simply my friend. To me, he wasn't a headline. He wasn't a criminal. He was just Blake, the kid whose house I rode my bike to after school. Only much later did I realize that the person I remembered and the person he eventually became were separated by years I never got to witness. Sometimes I still think about those afternoons from childhood and wonder where things changed for him. Maybe the warning signs really were there. Maybe they weren't. Maybe I'm only connecting those memories now because I know the ending. Either way, it's a sobering reminder that the people we know as children don't always become the people we expect them to be, and sometimes the most disturbing stories are the ones that begin with someone who once seemed completely ordinary. The story of Hisashi Ochi is often described as one of the most tragic workplace accidents in modern history, not only because of the nuclear accident itself, but because of the prolonged suffering that followed. In September 1999, Hisashi Ochi was working at a uranium processing facility in Tokaimura, Japan, during the preparation of nuclear fuel. A series of serious procedural failures led to a criticality accident, a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction that should never have occurred. Investigations later found that workers had been using an unauthorized method to speed up the process. Instead of following approved safety procedures, uranium solution was being poured into a precipitation tank in quantities that exceeded safe limits. Once the critical amount was reached, an uncontrolled chain reaction began almost instantly. A brilliant blue flash reportedly filled the room. That flash was a sign that an intense burst of radiation had just been released. Ouchie was standing closest to the tank. In a fraction of a second, he received an unimaginably high dose of ionizing radiation, one of the highest accidental radiation exposures ever survived for more than a brief period. 2 of his co-workers were also exposed, although their doses were significantly lower. The accident itself lasted only moments. The consequences would last for months. Initially, Ouchie remained conscious. He was able to speak with medical staff and describe what had happened. At first, he appeared far better than anyone would have expected, given the amount of radiation he had absorbed. But radiation injuries are unlike ordinary trauma. Instead of causing damage that can immediately be seen from the outside, the radiation had devastated his body at the cellular level. The DNA inside countless cells throughout his body had been catastrophically damaged. His bone marrow, the tissue responsible for producing blood cells, was effectively destroyed. Without functioning bone marrow, the body can no longer replace white blood cells, red blood cells, or platelets. As the days passed, doctors began witnessing the full extent of the damage. His immune system collapsed. Without white blood cells, even ordinary bacteria became life-threatening. His skin, which constantly replaces itself under normal conditions, gradually lost the ability to regenerate. Large areas became severely damaged as the tissues responsible for healing simply stopped functioning. Internally, the damage was even more extensive. Organs that depend on rapidly dividing cells, including the intestines, began to fail. Fluid loss became extremely difficult to control. Despite intensive treatment, his body struggled to repair even the smallest injuries because the basic cellular machinery required for healing had been destroyed. Doctors at one of Japan's leading hospitals employed every advanced treatment available at the time. Specialists attempted stem cell transplantation in the hope of restoring his bone marrow. He received enormous volumes of blood products. He underwent repeated surgeries and intensive supportive care. The medical teams involved were among the most experienced physicians available. Yet every improvement seemed temporary. His body simply could not recover from the extent of the radiation damage. The tragedy has also become the subject of considerable debate over the years. Many accounts circulating online claim that doctors deliberately kept him alive against his wishes, or continued treatment solely for scientific observation. Those claims are difficult to verify and are often exaggerated. Published medical accounts indicate that treatment decisions involved discussions with his family and reflected the ethical standards and medical practices of the time. As with many critical care cases, physicians continued aggressive treatment while assessing whether recovery remained possible. As his condition deteriorated, complications became increasingly severe. He experienced repeated infections, organ failure, and episodes in which his heart stopped and had to be restarted. Each new complication placed additional strain on a body that had already lost much of its ability to heal. After approximately 83 days in the hospital, Hisashi Ouchie died on December 21, 1999, from multiple organ failure resulting from the radiation exposure. He was 35 years old. The Tokaimura accident triggered major investigations into safety practices at the facility. Authorities concluded that the disaster was largely preventable. The company operating the plant had tolerated unsafe working procedures, insufficient training, and repeated departures from approved protocols. The accident became a catalyst for sweeping changes to Japan's nuclear safety regulations and oversight. Today, Hisashi Ouchie's story is remembered for several reasons. It highlights how devastating acute radiation syndrome can be when exposure reaches extraordinary levels. It demonstrates the importance of strict nuclear safety procedures and the catastrophic consequences of ignoring them. And it continues to raise difficult ethical questions about the limits of modern medicine. Cases like this force doctors and families to confront one of the hardest questions in healthcare. When should every possible treatment be pursued? And when does continuing treatment no longer serve the patient's best interests? Reasonable people can disagree about where that line should be, especially when the outcome is uncertain. What isn't really in dispute is the human tragedy at the center of the story. A young worker reported for what should have been an ordinary day on the job. Within seconds, a preventable industrial accident changed the course of his life forever. Hisashi Ochi did not become famous because of anything he chose to do. He became known because he endured one of the most severe accidental radiation injuries ever documented, and his case permanently shaped discussions about nuclear safety, emergency preparedness, radiation medicine, and the ethical challenges of treating patients with injuries beyond the limits of what modern medicine can realistically repair. The tragedy involving Paria Fuel Trading Company is one of those industrial disasters that's difficult to forget, not only because of how the accident happened, but because of what reportedly happened afterward. The incident began during maintenance work on an underwater oil pipeline off the coast of Trinidad and Tobago. A team of divers had been sent to carry out repairs when something went catastrophically wrong. A pressure imbalance inside the pipeline created an extremely powerful vacuum, pulling several divers into the pipe. Some of the men were killed almost instantly. Others survived the initial incident. One diver in particular was known to have remained alive inside the pipeline for many hours. Video footage and communications recovered afterward showed that trapped divers were still alive, searching for air pockets and trying to find a way out. They were able to communicate with one another, and there was evidence that at least some of them survived long after the initial accident. That fact is what makes the case especially heartbreaking. The issue wasn't simply that an accident occurred. It was the allegation that the surviving divers were never given a meaningful rescue attempt. According to evidence presented during the Commission of Inquiry, Paria stated that it had no rescue plan for an emergency of this kind. The company argued that it had no legal obligation to attempt a rescue, and maintained that sending additional divers into the pipeline would have placed more lives at risk. Families of the trapped men, however, argued that their loved ones were left alive inside the pipeline, without anyone making a serious effort to bring them out. They also alleged that outside rescue efforts were delayed or prevented, claiming experienced divers willing to attempt a rescue were not allowed to proceed because of safety concerns raised by the company. Whether a rescue could ultimately have succeeded remains a matter of technical debate among experts. Some specialists have argued that the risks to rescuers were extraordinarily high, and that an attempted rescue might have led to additional deaths. Others have maintained that there was a window of opportunity during which a carefully planned rescue had at least some chance of success. That disagreement has been central to the public discussion ever since. What is not disputed is that the Commission of Inquiry reached extremely critical conclusions about the company's actions. In November 2023, the Commission concluded that Paria's conduct could reasonably be described as gross negligence. The report went further, recommending that the Director of Public Prosecutions consider criminal charges against the company for what is commonly referred to as corporate manslaughter. That was an unusually strong recommendation. Rather than describing the tragedy as merely an unfortunate workplace accident, the Commission suggested there was sufficient evidence to consider whether criminal responsibility existed at the corporate level. The legal process continued after the Commission released its findings. In September 2024, criminal charges were filed against managers associated with Paria, as well as representatives of Land and Marine Contracting Services Ltd., the contractor responsible for carrying out the pipeline repair work. Those charges marked a significant development because they shifted the focus from regulatory criticism to potential criminal accountability. Whether those prosecutions ultimately result in convictions is a question for the courts. Criminal cases require prosecutors to prove their allegations beyond a reasonable doubt, and the accused are entitled to defend themselves against the charges. Your concern that the outcome could amount to nothing more than minor penalties is understandable, especially given the seriousness of the allegations and the loss of life. At the same time, it's worth avoiding assumptions about how the case will end before the legal process is complete. Depending on the evidence presented and the applicable law, outcomes in corporate criminal cases can range from acquittals to substantial penalties, including convictions of individuals where prosecutors meet the required legal standard. Regardless of the eventual verdict, the Commission's findings have already had a major impact. They raised difficult questions about emergency planning, employer responsibilities, rescue obligations, and how companies operating in high-risk industries prepare for worst-case scenarios. For many people, this tragedy isn't remembered solely because of the initial accident. It's remembered because of the haunting possibility that some of the trapped divers remained alive, waiting for help that never came. That aspect of the case continues to shape public debate, and is one reason it has become one of the most widely discussed industrial disasters in Trinidad and Tobago's history. It happened years ago, but it's still one of the biggest blank spaces in my life. I had gone out with a group of friends for a night of drinking. Nothing unusual. Just a typical night out where everyone planned to relax, have a few drinks, and enjoy ourselves. We weren't doing anything reckless, and according to the people who were with me, we had actually been pacing ourselves instead of trying to get completely wasted. My friends have all told me the same thing ever since. When they left around 11 o'clock that night, I seemed completely coherent. I was talking normally, walking normally, holding conversations without any problems. Nobody remembers me acting so intoxicated that I couldn't take care of myself. Looking back, that's one of the details that has always bothered me the most. After that point, everything becomes fragmented. Instead of memories, I have disconnected flashes that don't fit together. I remember being in a bed with someone. Then I remember falling out of that bed. I remember being put into a shower for some reason. Then, nothing again. The next thing I clearly remember is opening my eyes while lying completely naked on a couch. For a few seconds, I had absolutely no idea where I was. I just remember staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how I had gotten there. My head felt foggy, not like a normal hangover, more like I had skipped several hours of my life. I got up and slowly walked upstairs. Eventually, I found my clothes and my bag. One thing immediately stood out. The bed I'd vaguely remembered had been completely stripped of its sheets. I don't know why. I still don't. At the time, I was too confused to even think about it. I just wanted to get dressed and leave. Somehow, I made my way outside. Only then did I realize I wasn't actually very far from home. I was only a couple of streets away from my house. I have no memory of walking home. None, apparently I did, because I woke up later in my own bed. But I can't tell you how I got there. That entire part of the night simply doesn't exist in my memory. When I woke up again, something was very wrong. My wrist hurt so badly that I immediately knew it wasn't a normal sprain. The pain was intense. I tried wrapping it with a tensor bandage, but I couldn't even tolerate the pressure. It hurt too much. At that point, I decided I needed medical attention. I drove myself to the emergency room. While I was sitting in the waiting area, trying to distract myself from the pain, one of the nurses walked over. She asked me a question that completely caught me off guard. She wanted to know if I was aware that I had bruising around my neck. I remember just staring at her. I had no idea what she was talking about. I hadn't even looked closely in a mirror. I certainly didn't remember anything happening to my neck. The nurse's expression immediately changed. The conversation suddenly became much more serious. Instead of simply treating a wrist injury, the medical staff began asking questions about what had happened the night before. Questions I couldn't answer. Where had I been? Who had I been with? Did I remember losing consciousness? Did I remember anyone hurting me? Did I think someone had given me something without my knowledge? Every answer I gave was the same. I don't know. I can't remember. I have no idea. The situation quickly shifted from treating what I thought was simply a broken wrist to investigating the possibility that I had been drugged and sexually assaulted. It was surreal. Only a few hours earlier, I thought I just had a fun night out with friends. Now I was sitting in a hospital trying to explain several missing hours that had completely disappeared from my memory. X-rays eventually confirmed that my wrist was broken. Even today, I don't know exactly how it happened. Did I fall? Did someone push me? Did I try to defend myself? I have no answers. The bruises on my neck raised even more questions. I couldn't explain those either. I don't remember anyone grabbing me. I don't remember struggling. I don't remember anything that would account for those injuries. That's probably the hardest part, not knowing. If I had a clear memory, at least I'd know what happened. Instead, all I have are disconnected moments that refuse to fit together into a complete story. Every once in a while, I still replay those fragments in my head. The bed, falling onto the floor, the shower, the couch, the stripped sheets. Then, nothing. It's like trying to complete a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. One of the worst moments came when I had to call my mom. I remember trying to figure out how to explain the situation. At first, I thought I was just calling to tell her I'd hurt myself after drinking too much. That conversation changed very quickly. Instead of saying, "I think I broke my wrist," I found myself explaining that the hospital believed I might have been sexually assaulted. Even saying those words out loud felt unreal. I remember thinking how ridiculous the whole conversation sounded because I couldn't answer any of the obvious questions she was asking me. Who? Where? What happened? I didn't know. I still don't. That's the part people sometimes don't understand about memory loss connected to trauma or suspected drug-facilitated assault. The uncertainty can become its own kind of burden. There's no clear ending, no complete explanation, no way to confidently fill in the missing hours. You find yourself wondering about ordinary details years later. Whose house was it? Who else was there? How did I end up on that couch? Why were the sheets removed? How did my wrist break? What caused the bruises around my neck? Those questions never really go away. Time moves forward, but the missing pieces remain missing. Looking back now, I also think about how vulnerable someone becomes when they lose the ability to remember or protect themselves. You trust that the people around you will make sure you get home safely. Most of the time, that's exactly what happens. But when something goes wrong, the experience can leave you questioning events you'll never be able to reconstruct. Years have passed since that night. My wrist healed. The bruises disappeared. Life continued, but the uncertainty never really left. To this day, I honestly don't know what happened during those missing hours. I don't know who was responsible. I don't know whether I'll ever know. All I have are a few scattered memories, a broken wrist, bruises I couldn't explain, and a hospital visit that turned what I thought was an ordinary hangover into one of the most confusing and frightening experiences of my life. Sometimes people ask what the worst part was. It wasn't the broken bone. It wasn't even waking up somewhere unfamiliar. It was realizing that an important part of my own life had simply vanished, leaving behind injuries, unanswered questions, and a story that I'll probably never be able to finish. I was 16 years old, and I had only recently gotten my driver's license. I was still nervous behind the wheel, and honestly, I barely knew my way around my own town. Driving anywhere unfamiliar usually meant getting lost. Back then, I had a close friend from school. She was one of the popular girls, the kind everyone described as boy crazy. She always seemed to have a boyfriend or someone she was interested in, and most of the guys at school wanted to date her. I won't lie, I had a crush on her too. Unfortunately for me, she didn't see me that way. She liked athletic, outgoing guys, while I was probably the biggest nerd in our class. We never dated, but we became really good friends. For whatever reason, she trusted me. Whenever she was having problems with a boyfriend, she'd message me. She'd vent about arguments, jealousy, or whatever drama she was dealing with at the time. Afterward, she'd usually delete the messages because many of the guys she dated were incredibly possessive, and she didn't want them seeing that she had been talking to another guy, even if it was completely innocent. That was just how things were. Then one night, something happened that I've never forgotten. It was the middle of winter on a school night. I was asleep when my phone rang. Even before answering, I knew something was wrong. She almost never called me. We always texted. The fact that she was calling, especially that late at night, immediately got my attention. I answered, and the moment I heard her voice, I knew this wasn't a normal conversation. She was whispering. Her voice was shaking. She sounded terrified. She asked me one question. Could I come pick her up? Before I could ask what had happened, she quickly gave me an address. Then she asked me to bring some clothes, specifically a shirt, underwear, and a pair of sweatpants. There wasn't time for any explanation. She hung up almost immediately. I remember just sitting there for a second, staring at my phone. I knew something was seriously wrong. This was years before smartphones and GPS navigation were common. I barely knew how to drive across town, let alone into another city in the middle of the night. The address she gave me was her boyfriend's house. I had never been there before. I got onto the family computer, pulled up MapQuest, printed out the directions, grabbed the clothes she had asked for, and quietly headed outside. I didn't even start my car in the driveway. I pushed it down the street first. I was terrified my parents would hear the engine and stop me before I could leave. Once I was far enough away, I finally started the car and began following the printed directions. The entire drive, I kept wondering what had happened. Nothing made sense. Why did she need clothes? Why was she whispering? Why had she sounded so frightened? By the time I reached the house, my heart was pounding. Everything was quiet. The neighborhood was completely still. I parked nearby and waited. A few moments later, the front door slowly opened. She stepped outside as quietly as she could, obviously trying not to wake anyone inside the house. Then I realized why she had asked me to bring clothes. She wasn't wearing any. She was completely naked. Her makeup was smeared across her face from crying. Her hair was tangled and messy. She looked exhausted. More than anything, she looked terrified. She climbed into the passenger seat without saying much. The first thing she told me was to drive, so I did. As we pulled away from the house, she quickly started putting on the clothes I had brought. I finally asked what had happened. She tried to answer. She got a few words out before breaking down crying again. Between sobs, she told me she had gone to her boyfriend's birthday party. After that, she remembered nothing. The next thing she knew, she woke up in the middle of the room. She said she had no memory of what had happened after arriving at the party. When she woke up, she and several other people, including her boyfriend, were all unclothed. That was all she could manage to tell me. She couldn't keep talking without crying. I didn't push for details. I just kept driving. The rest of the ride was almost completely silent. I took her home. She got out of the car. I don't remember either of us saying much before she went inside. Then I drove back home. I slipped back into the house the same way I had left. By the time I finally got into bed, I had maybe 2 hours before I needed to get up for school. The next morning felt surreal. It was like the entire night had happened in another reality. We saw each other at school. Neither of us mentioned it. Not once. Life somehow continued. We never talked about that night again. At 16 years old, I don't think I fully understood what she had been trying to tell me. I knew something terrible had happened. I knew she was scared. I knew she had needed help. But I don't think I truly grasped the weight of the situation. I was just a kid myself. 17 years have passed since then. I'm a parent now. I have children of my own. I also have a daughter who means everything to me. Becoming a father completely changed how I look back on that night. When I remember that frightened 16-year-old girl climbing into my car, shaking, crying, and trying to put her clothes back on while struggling to explain what she couldn't even remember herself, it hits me in a way it never did back then. I can't tell the story now without getting emotional. As a teenager, I saw someone who needed a ride home. As an adult, I see someone who had experienced something deeply traumatic. I also think about how much courage it must have taken for her to make that phone call. Out of everyone she knew, she called me. Not because I was the strongest. Not because I was her boyfriend. Not because I had all the answers. She called because she trusted me enough to know I would come. And I did. Looking back, I'm grateful that I answered the phone. I'm grateful I didn't ignore it because it was late. I'm grateful I figured out the directions instead of giving up because I didn't know where I was going. I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't picked up. Or if I had decided it could wait until morning. Eventually, life took us in different directions. We lost touch over the years, like so many friends from high school do. From what I can tell, she's been married for about a decade now. She has children. Her husband seems like a genuinely good man. We don't talk anymore. I don't message her. I don't try to reopen old memories. But every now and then, I'll come across her Facebook profile. I'll see pictures of her family, her kids, birthdays, vacations, and ordinary moments that look happy. Every time I do, I find myself hoping those photos reflect the life she truly has now. I hope she found peace. I hope she found happiness. Most of all, I hope that whatever happened on that winter night no longer defines who she is. Some memories stay with you forever, even when they don't belong to you. That night is one of mine, not because of what I saw, but because I still remember the fear in her voice when the phone rang, the relief on her face when she got into my car, and the quiet drive home where neither of us really knew what to say. 17 years later, those are still the moments that come back to me, and every time they do, I hope she's living the safe, happy life she deserved all along.